If you've ever seen an MRI, you may recognize that that's what that is. It's a photographic image of someone's brain, and we'll learn as we go into the lesson why I have a brain up there. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul concludes his letter to Timothy by warning him, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you, avoiding worldly and empty chatter and the opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge, which some have professed and thus gone astray from the truth. Now, if you have a King James Version of the Bible, instead of knowledge, falsely so-called, it says science. And that's fine, because what they looked at as knowledge then was much like what science was later. It was just a very early version of it. The philosophers were actually dabbling in science of a sort. And some of the astronomers, people like that, came from those times. So Paul is basically telling Timothy, be careful about this. There are people out there that are going to foist off philosophies and things like that as being truth, when in fact they are not true. So tonight we're going to be looking at some false science that we have today. Consider this the adult version of our children's lesson on evolution. First of all, let's look at what science is. And I've taken this definition as most everything I'm going to be reading tonight came right out of the Encarta Reference Library, so it's nothing that's been tainted by my viewpoints on it. And I'll tell you when I'm quoting things, and here we're going to quote from them that science defined as the systematic study of anything that can be examined, tested, and verified. And that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with science, real science. We have a lot of things today that are good things that we owe to science. The people discovered phenomena, and they tried to figure it out, and they learned to harness things like electricity, and we can be glad that this fan is working right now, and our lights are working because of science. There are many good things that have come out of science. But somehow along the way, and I know how it came about, the atheistic evolutionists tried to come up with the idea that science is the understanding of everything. Now let me tell you some things science can't do anything about. Science can't, by the definition, prove anything about a thought. There's no scientist can read my mind. They can't know what I'm thinking. And there isn't any way science can do that. Oh, they've got some little neuron things that they can put on your electrode to see that you are thinking when your brain is working or when it's dead, things like that. But science can't do anything about thinking. It doesn't know how. In fact, it can't. It's things that have to be examined, tested, and verified. It's physical. Science doesn't deal with emotion. And one very large thing that science doesn't deal with at all, and that's history. Science can't do anything about history. They have to have something they can grab hold of that has substance and they can test. And then they have to be able to verify that test to make sure every time they test it, it comes out the same. So there are a lot of things that science can't do. Nothing wrong with science. Nothing to be afraid of about science. Science cannot possibly prove there is no God. It can't prove that there is a God either. Science has nothing to do with that. So let's don't be afraid of science. And let's understand some things, and we're only going to touch some highlights because of time tonight. Science has been wrong so many times. Scientists, that is, because, science is dealt with by scientists, and scientists are human beings, and some of them make mistakes. In fact, they all do, because we all make mistakes. And some of them, like some regular people, are fraudulent. They actually warp things, change things to make it fit their viewpoint. And we're going to give you a couple of examples. One of them is a very old one, and this is a fraud. I don't know if in school you ever heard about the Piltdown Man. They like to tell you everything about evolution in school. They may not have the Piltdown Man in school, but it certainly is in history. Piltdown Man came about the beginning of the 20th century. And this is a man holding the skull that was from the Piltdown Man. But let me read to you what Encarta says about this. It was supposed to be the greatest archaeological discovery in history. Approximately 90 years ago, from the time this article was written, an amateur geologist uncovered fragments of skull and jawbones in a gravel pit on Piltdown Common in Sussex, England. At a scientific meeting in 1912, the assembled pieces, thought to be nearly 1 million years old, were presented to the world. Piltdown Man, a human-like skull with a large ape-like jaw. Here was proof of the prehistoric missing link, the crucial step of the evolutionary progression from primitive apes to modern humans. How did they come to the conclusion that it was 1 million years old? They didn't have some of the modern testing methods, which I respectfully disagree with most of them anyway. But it was 1 million years old because they had already made up their mind. And we have to understand this about prejudice when people are working. And prejudice is the opposite of science. Scientists should always be asking questions, not making up their minds and trying to prove it. But they had already made up their mind that something in between apes and human beings had to be around because they'd already agreed with Darwin. And so they had this idea and this schematic where these little ape-like creatures kept growing up until they were a human being. Now, all they were concerned about is finding something that proved their idea. And they figured, well, it must take millions of years for that to happen. And so they've got this piece of a skull and they've got this piece of a jaw. Now, in the 1950s, when modern chemical analysis came along, it showed that the bones were actually from two different sources. The jaw belonged to an orangutan and the skull to a human. Neither of them much more than 600 years old. Some modern trickster, after carefully filing down the fragments and staining them to make them appear ancient, had planted them in the gravel pit to be discovered. Piltdown Man may have lost his place in the annals of paleoanthropology, it's a hard word to say, but he lives on as perhaps the most notorious example of scientific fraud in history. Unfortunately, this was not the first instance of scientific misconduct ever recorded, and certainly not the last. Now, that's all taken directly from Encarta Reference Library. You can look it up yourself if you have Encarta, or probably any other encyclopedia would tell about the same thing. But why was these wise men, these scientists, so easily fooled? Because they had already made up their mind that they wanted to find that. And so you're going to find what you want to find. But that isn't science. Why not question it? But they didn't. And of course, that's what they had. Here's another one. This one happened in the mid-20th century. And again, I'm going to be reading directly from Encarta. So there's no question that I'm making these things up. The case of British psychologist Cyril Burt during the middle part of the 20th century provides another example. Burt supposedly carried out nature versus nurture experiments, in some instances on twins who had been raised apart, in support of the theory that intelligence is primarily inherited at birth rather than a trait that can be affected by upbringing or other factors. I'm going to tell you something else that's going to sound like a strong indictment, and it is a strong indictment, and I believe every word of it. The original evolutionists were racist, and many of them that came after them were racist. And everything they wanted to come out and prove, and it started in England, and England already ruled most of the world about that time, is that the white English-speaking people were the superior race, and everybody else was somewhere on the evolutionary chain. Now, they've toned that down a lot nowadays because they can't get away with it, but there are probably still some of them that believe that. Well, this guy believed that kind of stuff. And what is he saying in here? Burt's findings on intelligence quotients were very influential in British educational policy. An IQ test administered to 11-year-olds, for example, determined whether a child would be placed in an academic or vocational school. If you believe that people are born with whatever intelligence they're going to have, and you can't do anything about it, so if you're, from an inferior race, you're going to be dumber, and from a superior race, you're going to be smarter, well, then you're going to find some way to prove it. This guy went a long way to prove it. Let's take, say, and I'm making up the backgrounds of all these people. I just got some pictures out. But let's take this couple as a middle-class couple, say in England or the United States, that can give their children a good education. And then let's take this other group of people who I'm not sure what their racial makeup is, but I'm guessing they may be from Afghanistan, who are immigrants that have come into the country with their 11-year-old child. And the two 11-year-olds are going to be tested. Well, which one of them do you think is going to get the higher IQ test? We can be pretty sure why, because we understand it has nothing to do with where you're born, but it has to do with your advantages. And because this one child may not have had the advantages, he's going to be behind in school. And he's going to test lower on the IQ test. But he can be trained and taught, and he can be as smart as any other child. But not according to Burt. And because of Burt, England went through this for a long time. During his life, he was regarded as one of the United Kingdom's greatest psychologists. It was not until after his death in 1971 That scholar reviewed